Which floor is the server room on? That was the first thing she ever said to him. 3 words. No greeting, no introduction, just a question from a woman who moved through the world like she'd already decided what every room should look like before she entered it. 11, he said. Take the east elevator. The west one skips it. She nodded once, already turning to leave. Then she paused. It wasn't a long pause. 1 beat, maybe 2. She looked back at him with an expression he couldn't read. Something that wasn't quite curiosity, but wasn't quite nothing either. Then she was gone. And Marcus Thorne went back to his coffee. He didn't think about it. He didn't know that she would think about it later. He didn't know that when everything came apart, she'd remember this moment, this kitchen, this man who'd answered her question, and then returned to his work without trying to impress her or introduce himself or ask for anything at all. He just went back to his desk. That was Wednesday morning, early November in Chicago. The kind of morning where the lake sent cold through every window facing east, where the sky couldn't decide between gray and pale silver, where the coffee in the 14th floor kitchen was always slightly too bitter no matter who made it. Marcus had been making it the same way for 9 years. He'd stopped apologizing for the bitterness a long time ago. Some things were what they were. He stood at the counter at 7:52 in the morning, measuring grounds into the filter with the precision he brought to everything. His movements were careful, deliberate, the worn cuffs of his jacket, the quiet way he occupied space, the mug his daughter had painted for him at a birthday party last spring. Wobbly purple letters spelling Dad, and a yellow sun that looked more like a starfish. He noticed things. He always had. He noticed that the overhead light in the kitchen flickered at irregular intervals. He noticed that the coffee machine made a sound it hadn't made last week. He noticed that the woman who'd just appeared in the doorway moved like someone who'd already decided what she wanted before she asked for it. That was Evelyn Cross, the new CEO, 3 days into her role. He didn't know her yet. He would. Marcus returned to his desk with his coffee. His desk was near the window, 14th floor, east side of the building. From where he sat, he could see the lake in the distance when the weather was clear. Today it was just a suggestion, a darker gray against the gray of the sky. But he looked at it anyway. His wife Claire had loved the lake. She used to say that looking at something that big every day reminded her that most problems were smaller than they felt. Claire had been gone for 2 years. He opened his top drawer. Inside, folded into quarters, was a drawing his 5-year-old daughter Sophie had given him the night before. She'd pressed it into his hand at bedtime. With the gravity of someone delivering something important, it showed a man standing on top of a very tall building. He was holding a star. She said it was for protection. He didn't ask what from. He looked at it for a moment. Then he closed the drawer and opened his email. The silence was still there. 4 emails. 4 warnings, 4 detailed reports explaining exactly what was going wrong with the authentication protocol and exactly how to fix it. Each one sent to Derek Vance, the VP of Engineering. Each one received in silence. Marcus wasn't surprised, but he was tired. There's a particular kind of tiredness that comes from being right about something and being unable to make anyone else see it. It settles into the body like weather. He'd been carrying it for weeks. He closed the tab. He opened the project file he was supposed to be working on. He began his day. But he couldn't shake the feeling that something was coming. Something he couldn't stop. He just didn't know what it was yet. 72 hours earlier, Marcus had been sitting alone at his desk after the floor emptied out. Everyone else had gone home. The overhead lights had dimmed to their evening setting. The cleaning crew had already passed through, emptying trash cans, wiping down conference tables. But Marcus was still there. He was writing a report, the 4th one in 2 months. Each one more urgent than the last. Each one sent to Derek Vance. Each one ignored. The report detailed a critical vulnerability in the authentication protocol. Latency spikes at irregular intervals. A handshake timeout in the secondary node. Signs that would mean nothing to anyone who hadn't built the architecture from the inside. Marcus had built it. Every layer, every failsafe, every line of logic, 9 years ago, when Callaway Technologies was a startup in a rented office, and Marcus was the only engineer who understood what they were trying to build. He'd worked 14-hour days for 7 months, often past midnight, often for no additional pay. Because it mattered, because he wanted it to be right. He'd put his initials in the metadata of the core module because he wanted there to be a record, something permanent, something that couldn't be removed. M.A.T. Marcus Allen Thorne. This time he marked the email urgent. He copied the head of IT. He attached documentation and logs and timestamps that proved exactly what was happening and exactly when it had started. He sent it at 11:47 at night. Then he went home to his daughter. He didn't know what would happen next, but he suspected. 1 hour later, Derek Vance forwarded that same report to the IT team. With Marcus's name stripped from the header, the analysis appeared to come from Derek himself. The detailed explanations, the precise recommendations, the urgent warnings, all of it under Derek's name. Marcus saw the forwarded email the next morning in the shared inbox. He stared at the screen for a long moment. His jaw tightened. His hand stayed perfectly still on the keyboard. Then he closed the tab, and he went to make coffee. He didn't confront Derek. He didn't complain to HR. He didn't tell anyone what he'd seen. He just absorbed it. The way he'd absorbed so many things over the past 6 years. Because fighting took time, and energy, and attention, and Marcus had none of those things to spare. Not anymore. That evening, Marcus picked up Sophie from his mother-in-law's house at 5:45. Helen opened the door with the expression she always wore now, something between gratitude that Marcus was still standing, and grief that standing seemed to be all he was doing. She worried about him. He knew that. She told him 6 months after Claire died that he needed to start living again. Not just surviving. He'd nodded, thanked her, gone home, and sat at the kitchen table until 2 a.m, trying to figure out what the difference was. He still didn't know. Sophie came running from the back room, pencil box clutched to her chest, backpack bouncing against her shoulders. She was 5 years old. She carried that box of colored pencils everywhere she went, the way other children carried stuffed animals. She drew people, strangers mostly. She'd study someone for a long time without speaking, then go home and draw them from memory. Sometimes she gave the drawings away without explaining why. Her kindergarten teacher called it unusual. Marcus called it seeing. Sophie saw things that other people missed. She'd gotten that from her mother. She launched herself at Marcus with the complete trust of a child who's never once been dropped. He caught her the way he always did, one arm under her, the other around her back, holding on. "How was your day?" he asked. "I drew Mrs. Patterson," she said. "She has sad eyes but a happy mouth. I think she misses someone." Marcus thought about Sophie's kindergarten teacher, a woman in her 60s who'd lost her husband the year before. He wondered how his daughter had seen what he had missed. "That's very observant," he said. She nodded, accepting this as accurate, and began telling him about the lunch she'd eaten, and the book they'd read, and whether butterflies could feel cold. She'd been thinking about it because it was almost winter, and she was worried about them. They walked home through the November dark. The streetlights were already on. The cold found the gap between his collar and his neck. But he didn't zip his jacket, because Sophie had her hand in his pocket, holding on to his fingers, and he didn't want to make her let go. After dinner, while Sophie colored at the kitchen table, Marcus sat in the chair by the window with his laptop. He wasn't working. He was thinking. The authentication protocol was going to fail. He was certain of it now. The latency spikes were increasing in frequency. The secondary node was showing signs of cascade stress. He documented all of it. He'd explained exactly what would happen and exactly how to prevent it, and no one had responded. He thought about sending a 5th email. He thought about walking into Derek's office tomorrow morning and demanding an answer. He thought about a lot of things. Then Sophie appeared beside him with a piece of paper in her hands. She'd been looking at his laptop earlier, studying the photograph on the screen while he searched for something. He hadn't thought she was paying attention, but she always was. The drawing was a woman with dark hair in a blue blazer, standing in front of a large window. The colors were exactly right. The expression was careful, deliberate, watching. Evelyn Cross. "She looks nice," Sophie said. It wasn't a question. Marcus looked at the drawing. He looked at his daughter. "How do you know she's nice?" he asked. "You've never met her?" Sophie considered this with the seriousness she brought to most things. "Her eyes," she said. "They look like she's deciding something important. People who decide important things are usually nice. Otherwise, they wouldn't care enough to decide." Marcus couldn't find anything to say. Sophie took his silence as confirmation and went back to her pencil box. "I'm going to give it to her," she said matter-of-factly, "when I meet her." "You might not meet her," Marcus said. Sophie looked at him with patient certainty. "I will," she said. "You look at her picture the same way you used to look at pictures of Mama." She went back to the table. Marcus sat very still for a long moment. Then he closed the laptop and went to make her a snack. The termination notice came the next morning. The HR manager's name was Patricia. They'd never spoken before. She appeared in his doorway at 9:14. Manila folder pressed to her chest. She was looking at a point approximately 6 inches above his left ear. "Mr. Thorne," she began. "I understand," he said. "The company has determined that your position is no longer I understand." She stopped. He could see her recalibrating. This wasn't how it usually went. There was supposed to be confusion, or anger, or at least questions, something she could manage. "There's a box," she said, finally, "for your personal effects." The box was cardboard, standard issue, the kind that held reams of paper. He'd seen them in supply closets for 9 years without ever needing one. He placed the cactus in first. He'd bought it the week Sophie was born, because Claire had said that every desk needed something alive on it. He placed Claire's photograph second, the one from before the diagnosis, when her smile was still the kind that expected futures. He placed Sophie's drawing of the star third, folded carefully into quarters. 12 words on a piece of paper. 9 years dissolved in one signature. He didn't look at Derek Vance's office as he walked to the elevator. He didn't look at Jennifer from accounting, who had always said good morning, and was now studying her screen with remarkable intensity. He didn't look at the intern he'd trained for 3 months, who was walking in the opposite direction with sudden purpose. No one said goodbye. No one said anything at all. The elevator opened. He stepped inside. The doors closed. In the lobby, he passed the security desk. Ramon, who'd worked mornings for 6 years, looked up, then looked away. He'd already been told. The building had a protocol for this. Marcus pushed through the revolving door and stepped into the gray November light. He stood on the sidewalk for a moment, the cardboard box in his arms, the cold finding every gap in his clothes. 14 floors above him, Evelyn Cross was standing at the glass wall of the executive suite, looking down at the lobby. She watched a quiet man carry a small box through the revolving door and disappear into the street. She didn't know who he was. She didn't know why she couldn't look away. She only knew that something about the way he walked, steady, unhurried, with his head up and his shoulders straight, made her think of a word she hadn't thought about in a long time. Dignity. Her assistant called her name. She turned back toward the day. Marcus got home at 11 in the morning. The apartment was quiet in the way apartments are quiet when you're in them at an hour you're not supposed to be. The refrigerator cycling, the building settling, the clock above the stove marking seconds with no obligation to stop. He'd hated that clock since the month after Claire died. It kept going while everything else had stopped, and he'd never quite forgiven it. He set the cactus on the kitchen table. He sat on the floor with his back against the refrigerator. He didn't cry. He just sat. After a while, he got up. He went to the bedroom. He opened the nightstand drawer. He took out the phone he hadn't touched in over a year. The battery was dead. He plugged it into the charger on Sophie's dresser and waited. Inside that phone were the last photographs Claire had ever taken, 3 days before she died. When the afternoon light came through the hospital window at an angle that made everything in the room look gentler than it was, she was smiling in two of them, laughing in one. He couldn't bring himself to wipe the device. Every few months he'd charge it, look at the photographs for a few minutes, return it to the drawer. It was the only way he knew how to visit her. Today he scrolled past the photographs. He opened the email. There was a message from Derek Vance, sent 2 years ago, the year the authentication protocol went fully live across the company. 4 lines. Best not to bring any of this up with anyone. Everything has been handled. I'm sure you understand. Marcus read it again. Then he closed the phone, but his mind went further back. March of 2019. Claire had been diagnosed 4 days earlier, stage 3 ovarian cancer. The oncologist had explained the treatment protocol and the costs with the measured calm of someone who delivered this kind of information before. The deposit required within 72 hours to begin the first treatment phase was a number Marcus didn't have. He'd called Derek from the hospital parking garage, sitting on the hood of his car in the cold. Derek had answered on the second ring with an offer. Buy the authentication protocol outright. No conditions, no delays, money in his account before the end of the week. All he needed was a signature. Marcus hadn't read every line. Author attribution, not applicable. Classification of services, consultant, work for hire. He'd needed Claire to get into treatment before Friday. He'd signed. She'd gotten 14 more months. It wasn't enough, but it was something. He'd never regretted the choice. He'd only regretted that it hadn't saved her. At 3:15, Marcus walked to Sophie's school. She came through the doors at full speed, backpack bouncing, pencil box clutched to her chest. She saw him, and her face changed the way it always did, brightening into the particular joy of a child who's exactly where she wants to be. "Daddy," she said, "you're early." "I am," he said, "like summer coming before spring." She considered this with great seriousness. "That doesn't make sense," she said. "But I don't mind." She took his hand. They walked home. 4 days later, the screens went red, 2:14 in the afternoon. Every authentication node across Callaway Technologies failed simultaneously, cascading, collapsing, folding into each other like dominoes that no one had seen coming. 12 engineers crowded the server room. They stood in front of screens that told them something was critically wrong, without telling them anything about where to begin. The report that explained the failure in precise detail. Marcus's report, forwarded by Derek under a different name 2 months earlier. It sat unread in the team's shared inbox. Without Marcus, there was no one who understood the architecture well enough to know which paragraph to read first. Derek Vance called an emergency meeting within the hour. He stood at the front of the conference room. He told the assembled department heads that the issue was contained, that his team had identified the root cause, that full resolution was achievable within 48 hours. He used the word actionable. He used it twice. He didn't mention the report. He didn't mention the 4 emails. He didn't mention Marcus. Evelyn Cross sat at the head of the table and listened without expression. She let him finish. Then she asked a specific technical question about the error handling logic in the authentication module. Derek answered with a generality. She asked about the cascade behavior in the secondary node and the expected propagation rate under current network load. Another generality, less confident than the first. She asked who had originally designed the core architecture. Derek's expression didn't change, but something behind it shifted. An outside contractor, he said. Someone no longer in contact. One of those situations that arises during a company's early growth phase. Evelyn wrote something down in red ink. "I need the complete personnel record for everyone who worked on the core infrastructure between 2018 and 2022, she said, and I need legal to pull every consulting contract from that same period. Frame it as a standard internal audit. Both on my desk before end of day. Derek said it seemed like a broad scope for an urgent situation. Evelyn said she appreciated his perspective. That night, at 10 o'clock, Evelyn was alone on the 14th floor. The cleaning crew had come and gone. The hallway lights were down to their overnight setting, a dim institutional yellow that made the space feel suspended between a working building and an empty one. She pulled up the original repository, the complete version history going back to the first commit 7 years ago. She went to the root files. She went to the metadata. In the author field of the core authentication module, 3 letters blinked back at her from the screen. MAT. She opened a second window. She went to the United States Patent and Trademark Office database. She entered the patent number she'd found embedded in the original build documentation, placed there by someone who'd wanted a permanent record. The result loaded without delay. Patent number 1, 0912558. B. Adaptive Layered Authentication Protocol. Filing date, March of 2019. Inventor, Marcus Allen Thorne. Licensee, Callaway Technologies, LLC. She read the name twice. Then she read it a third time. Then she opened the personnel file. The photograph loaded. The man from the 14th floor kitchen. The man who'd told her to take the east elevator. The man who'd smiled like it cost him nothing and gone back to his coffee without trying to impress her or introduce himself. The man she'd watched carry a cactus through the lobby 4 days ago while 30 people on that floor didn't bother to look up from their screens. She sat with his photograph on her monitor. She didn't look away for a long time. She thought about what kind of person builds something and then watches other people take credit for it and says nothing for 6 years. She thought about what kind of person sends 4 warnings that something's about to fail and then walks out without making anyone answer for the silence. She called Derek Vance at 10:52 that night. 1 question. No preamble. Was Marcus Thorne the person who designed this architecture? There was a pause on the line, 1 beat longer than any honest hesitation would require. She ended the call. The pause had told her everything. She sat in her car in the parking garage for a long time after that. Engine off, windows fogging at the edges, the city somewhere above her humming through the concrete. She opened LinkedIn on her phone and found his profile. No photograph, no biography. Status currently taking time for what matters most. She sat in the dark and thought about a man who'd invented the architecture that ran her company, who'd been quietly erased from his own work, who'd sent 4 warnings that it was failing, who'd walked out with a cactus and no parting words. She thought about the extra second she'd spent in that kitchen doorway before turning the corner. She hadn't understood it then. She still didn't entirely understand it now, but she knew what she was going to do about it. The next morning, Evelyn read the consulting contract from March 2019. 4 pages, clean type, the Callaway Technologies header at the top. She read through the compensation clause, the scope of services, the intellectual property section. She stopped at the credit line. Author attribution, not applicable. Classification of services rendered consultant work for hire. At the bottom of the 4th page was a residential address on the north side of Chicago. She tried the email listed beside it. The message bounced within seconds. She tried the phone number. Disconnected. Marcus had cut his costs since losing the job. Of course he had. She closed the folder. She took her jacket from the chair. She walked toward the elevator. Derek intercepted her in the hallway. He'd positioned himself carefully, near the elevator bank. The interception couldn't have been accidental. He suggested with practiced reasonableness that reaching out to a former employee whose contract had been legally terminated according to proper process could create unfavorable precedent. That it might be advisable to consult outside counsel first. His tone was professional concern, but his posture was a half degree too deliberate. His eyes were too steady in the way eyes get when a person is concentrating very hard on appearing at ease. Evelyn had spent enough years in rooms with people who had things to protect to know the difference between advice and management. She looked at him for exactly 1 second. "Thank you for your concern," she said. She walked past him. In that moment, Derek understood that he'd made an error. A VP of engineering doesn't have a specific and urgent opinion about which former consultants a CEO chooses to contact, unless he has a specific and urgent reason for wanting that person kept away. He'd shown her the shape of what he was protecting. He watched the elevator doors close in front of him. The address was still current. Marcus hadn't moved. He'd stayed because Sophie's school was 6 blocks away, because Claire's mother lived nearby, because it was the school Claire had always said she wanted for their daughter, back when she was still saying things like that. Evelyn drove north through the afternoon traffic. She parked on a side street. She walked up to the front door of a building with a small concrete stoop and a potted plant beside the entrance that had somehow managed to survive November. She knocked. She waited. Movement inside. The unhurried approach of someone interrupted mid-task who's coming without rushing. The door opened. Marcus stood there with a dish towel tucked into his apron. He was holding a cast iron pan. Behind him from the kitchen came the sound of a small person coloring. They looked at each other across the threshold. A moment passed between them. One of those moments that has a weight and a shape, but not yet a name. "I need to talk to you," she said. He turned toward the kitchen. "Sophie, go ahead and eat, sweetheart. I'll be right back." They went out to the small landing at the top of the exterior stairs. The November wind off Lake Michigan was direct and cold. Evelyn had her hands in her jacket pockets. Marcus leaned against the railing with his arms folded and waited. She asked him directly, with no preamble. Why had he signed the contract the way he had? Why had he left the author credit blank and said nothing for 6 years? He told her about Claire, not the photographs, not the way the light had come through the hospital window on the last good afternoon, but enough. The diagnosis, the 72 hours, the oncologist explaining the treatment protocol and the cost with measured calm. The deposit required before Friday to begin treatment was a number Marcus didn't have. He'd called Derek from the hospital parking garage, sitting on the hood of his car in the cold. Derek answered on the second ring with an offer. Money in his account before the end of the week. All he needed was a signature. "I needed her to have a chance," Marcus said quietly. "That was the only fact I was working with." Evelyn listened without filling the silence. He went inside and came back with the old phone. He unlocked it. He opened the email. He held it out to her without explanation. Derek Vance, 2021. The year that architecture went fully live across the company. Best not to bring any of this up with anyone. Everything has been handled. She read it twice. "You kept this for 5 years," she said, "and you never used it." "I kept the phone because of the photographs," Marcus said, "of Claire. I couldn't reset it. The email was just something that was there every time I opened it. Like something you know, but aren't ready to carry around." "Why didn't you tell anyone?" she asked. He turned to look through the kitchen window. Sophie had finished eating and was at the counter now, pressing a drawing against the refrigerator door with a piece of tape. Her tongue was out the side of her mouth while she worked to get it straight. The drawing went up slightly crooked. She frowned at it, peeled it back, repositioned it, stepped away to assess. Satisfied, she went back to the table. "Because I was too busy being a dad to be a hero," Marcus said quietly. "The way you say the facts that are most true. Without emphasis, without performance." Evelyn looked where he was looking. She saw the drawing on the refrigerator, the cactus on the kitchen table, the permission slip under a magnet near the door, the dish towel still hanging from his apron. She saw the whole shape of a life held together by a person who decided at some specific moment of grief that the only thing worth holding on to was the small human who needed him to keep standing. Something in her shifted. Not a professional recalibration, not a weighing of information, something older than that and less manageable. The front door opened. Sophie appeared with her pencil box and walked directly to Evelyn. With the certainty of a child who's already made a decision and is simply executing it, She held out a folded piece of paper. Evelyn unfolded it carefully. The woman with dark hair, the blue blazer, the large window behind her. Sophie had drawn this person 3 nights ago from her father's laptop screen and had been waiting with patient 5-year-old purpose for the chance to deliver it directly to its subject. "I drew you from the picture on Daddy's computer," Sophie said. "He looks at it a lot." Evelyn looked at the drawing. She looked at Marcus. His ears had gone red. "She does this," he said. "Draws strangers." "I'm not a stranger," Evelyn said. She crouched down to Sophie's level. "I'm the lady from your drawing. And you draw very well." "I know," Sophie said. She received this as accurate. Then she looked at Evelyn with the clear-eyed directness of a child who hasn't yet learned to soften truths. "You should come inside. Daddy made extra food because he always makes extra food. I think he's lonely, but he doesn't say so." Evelyn stood up. She looked at Marcus. He was studying the railing with great intensity. "Would you like to come inside?" he asked. "I would," she said. Evelyn drove home through the city with the drawing folded in the interior pocket of her jacket, the one on the left side, nearest to where a person's heart would be. She compiled everything: the patent, the commit log, the contract, Derek's email from 2021. She sent it to legal with a cover note requesting an independent assessment of the 2019 agreement and all personnel decisions that had followed it. Then she made tea. She sat by the window overlooking Lake Michigan. She'd paid a decade of long days to be able to look out through that window. Tonight the lake was dark, and the city lights lay on its surface like scattered coins. And she couldn't stop thinking about a sentence she'd heard on a back porch in November. "I was too busy being a dad to be a hero." At 2 minutes past 2 in the morning, her phone lit up. An email. From a personal address. No subject line. She opened it. 8 pages of technical documentation. Precise, exhaustive, organized with the clarity of someone who'd been carrying this problem in his mind for a very long time. The location of the failure, the error in the secondary node, the cascade it was generating, the exact sequence of patches required in order of priority with estimated resolution times for each step. At the bottom of the last page below the final technical line was a single sentence in plain text. "Not for the board, just because it needs to be fixed." Evelyn read it once. She read it again. She set the phone face down on the table and looked out at the lake, somewhere on the north side of Chicago, in a small apartment with a cactus on the kitchen table and a child's drawings typed to the refrigerator. Marcus Thorne had sat down after his daughter fell asleep. He'd opened his laptop. He'd looked at the architecture he'd built, the architecture that had been taken from him, the architecture he'd warned 4 times was going to fail, and he'd written a document no one had asked for. He wouldn't be compensated. He wouldn't be credited. He wouldn't even know that anyone would read it. But the thing was broken, and Marcus Thorne couldn't leave broken things alone. Evelyn thought about all the late nights she'd worked, the weekends, the holidays, the relationships she'd let go quiet because the work demanded more. She'd told herself it was about excellence. She'd told herself it was about building something that mattered. But she'd never worked past midnight to fix something for someone who'd hurt her. She'd never given away expertise without calculating the return. She'd never done the right thing at 2 in the morning with no audience and no expectation of anything in return. She wanted to be the kind of person who would. Derek Vance hadn't been passive overnight. 2 board members had received calls from him the previous evening. Carefully framed calls suggesting that Evelyn was perhaps allowing emotion to distort her judgment, that her relative inexperience with the technology sector might warrant the board's attention. He'd chosen the 2 members he assessed as most susceptible. He'd been wrong about one of them. The head of legal called Evelyn at 8:15 to report the contacts. She thanked him, asked him to document everything, told her assistant to schedule an emergency board meeting for 11. At 10:45, before she walked into the boardroom, she took the phone from her pocket and opened his email one final time. She read the last line. "Not for the board, just because it needs to be fixed." She put the phone away. She straightened her jacket. She walked in. She laid out the case without theatrics. the patent with his name on it, the commit log with the MAT author tag, the 2019 contract with the blank credit line. Derek's email projected on the screen at full size so that every person in the room could read it without assistance. The 4 unanswered warnings, each more urgent than the last, all sent before the crash, all forwarded to other recipients under a name that wasn't the name of the person who'd written them. And then the last piece. She described the document that had arrived in her personal inbox at 2 a.m. She read the final line aloud. Not for the board, just because it needs to be fixed. She let the room hold it in silence. 2 board members raised the legal defense as Derek had prepared them to. The contract was valid. The termination had followed proper process. There was no actionable breach. Evelyn didn't contest the legal ground. You're right that it was legal, she said. I'm asking whether it was right, and whether we're the kind of company that makes that distinction. She looked around the table. This man sent us a complete technical solution at 2 a.m. after we fired him. He wasn't asked. He won't be compensated. He has every reason to let this whole thing burn. And he chose to fix it anyway, because that's who he is. She paused. I want to know if this board is prepared to acknowledge what that means. The chairman asked whether it was possible to contact Mr. Thorne. I've already been in contact with him, Evelyn said. The question is whether we deserve to be. The vote was 6-1. Derek Vance was suspended pending investigation, effective immediately. The room cleared without much conversation. Evelyn drove to Sophie's school that afternoon. She spotted Marcus from across the street, standing at the gate with a paper bag in his hand. Jacket not quite heavy enough for November. Breath making small clouds in the cold. He looked up when she crossed toward him. He didn't look surprised. She was glad of it. The board wants to meet with you, she said. What for? He asked. To make it right. Before he could respond, the school doors opened and Sophie came through at full speed. Backpack swinging. Pencil box pressed to her chest. She launched herself at her father with the total trust of a child who's never once been dropped. He caught her with one arm. Then Sophie spotted Evelyn. Her face changed into the expression of someone who's been expecting a specific thing and is watching it arrive. You came back, Sophie said. I did, Evelyn said. Sophie nodded once with satisfaction. Then she looked at her father. I told you she would, Daddy. I drew it. The day Marcus walked back into Callaway Technologies, he brought his old laptop. Scuffed at the corners. A small blue star sticker on the lid that Sophie had applied one morning while he was making breakfast. He decided not to remove it. Inside was everything. The original design files. The first commit with its timestamp intact. The full chain of technical correspondence from the development period. He hadn't brought it to make a case. The case had already been made. He brought it because the architecture was still broken, and he intended to fix what needed fixing. They called him in. He sat at the long table across from 7 people who'd recently learned something about the company they governed that they hadn't previously known. He talked for 11 minutes. He described the failure precisely, its location in the secondary node, its origin in the latency issue he'd flagged 4 times, the cascade it had produced, the specific sequence of patches required in what order, and why each step mattered before the next. He wasn't performing. He wasn't angry. He was a person explaining something he understood completely to people who needed to understand it adequately. The board didn't interrupt him once. When he finished, he closed the laptop and sat back. The chairman said, "We owe you an apology, Mr. Thorne." Marcus nodded once. He didn't say it was all right. He didn't perform gratitude for words that were however well-intentioned a small thing relative to what they were for. He hadn't come for the apology. He stood up to leave. Evelyn caught him in the hallway. She held out an envelope. He took it. He opened it. He read every line this time, fully, to the last page, with no 72-hour deadline pressing on him from every direction. A long-term consulting contract. His name in the author credit field. The patent number cited correctly. Compensation at double his last salary. You didn't have to do this, he said. I know, she said. That's why I did it. He looked at her then, directly and fully, without the reflexive looking away he'd practiced since Claire died, when solitude had become the structure around which he organized everything else. Why, he asked. Not about the contract, about all of it. She held his gaze. Because I've spent 10 years building things, she said. Companies, reputations, the kind of success you can measure on a balance sheet. And somewhere in all of that, I forgot to ask what any of it was for. She paused. You sent a document at 2 in the morning to help a company that had erased you, not for credit, not for compensation, just because it was broken and you couldn't leave it broken. She looked at him. I've built a lot of things, but I've never been that person, and I wanted to find out if I still could be. They stood in the hallway. The building hummed around them. The elevator doors opened somewhere behind them and closed again. Thank you, he said. Evelyn. It was the first time he'd used her name. The corner of her mouth moved, just slightly, just enough for him to see if he was paying the kind of attention he was paying. He was paying attention. 6 weeks later, the architecture was restored. Marcus's name appeared on the technical documentation for the first time. The patent record was corrected to reflect the actual inventor. On the refrigerator at home, held by a moon-shaped magnet between a school calendar and a photograph of Claire, taken in summer light 10 years ago, Sophie's drawing was still there. The woman in the blue blazer, the dark hair, the forward gaze. At the bottom, in large, uneven letters written in red pencil, Miss Evelyn. The lady Daddy looks at. Every morning before he made coffee, Marcus looked at that drawing, and every morning he thought about whether there was a good reason to be on the north side of the city that day. There usually was, and on the days there wasn't, he made one.